Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicole France. I am part of the product marketing team at Contentful. And I also have an external title of evangelist, which is interesting because sitting in the product marketing team, you might think that I'm a product evangelist, but I am not. I am actually a problem evangelist, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But first, let me introduce my wonderful panelists for today. Eric Feige of VShift, Managing Director, and Chris Bach, co-founder of Netlify. Eric, why don't you start us off by introducing yourself in a few more words?
Sure. Can you hear me? There we go. Great. I'm Managing Director of Strategy at VShift. I've been a head of digital for a few different companies, including Deloitte, KPMG, JP Morgan, Prudential. So I've been in the space of introducing innovative ways of transforming companies, ultimately through multi-channel digital. And this topic of composability is one that throughout my career I've used to bring change to organizations.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Black. I'm a co-founder, CSO and CCO at Netlify, a platform for web developers. Before that I spent 15 years in agencies, and I also sit on the board of directors at the Market Alliance.
So, no shortage of brain power to bring to this topic of composability. What is composable? We'll get to that in a moment, but I mentioned that I'm a problem evangelist. What does that mean, you might reasonably ask? Well, it turns out that one of the things that happens when you really try to push the boundaries of applying new technologies is it solves a whole bunch of problems, and it actually creates a whole new set of other ones. And so I really see a whole lot of my job here at Contentful as helping to identify and articulate what those problems are, because as anybody who has ever gotten anywhere close to a 12-step program will tell you, the first step is understanding that you have a problem. So let's come to this topic of composability. I will go back in my own career, back many years to when I was a Gartner analyst, and in fact, the last conference presentation that I gave at Gartner in 2006 was on the topic of cloud computing. And I had this whole great setup about how we were finally moving from the cottage industry of companies building their own IT infrastructure and doing it at a very suboptimal scale within organizations to this idea of the cloud finally being an inevitable thing. By the way, it took another decade for cloud computing to actually become mainstream, but I think there's a really interesting parallel there to what we're talking about here today, which is it was such a substantial change in the underlying technology architecture that it fundamentally changed how we think about technology investments, but also really importantly, how we invest in skills, how we organize our teams, and how we even think about what it is we're trying to do as businesses and how technology supports us to do that. So let me just kick this over to both of you. What do you think? Is this a question now of composable architecture being more of an inevitability? So a question of when companies are going to adopt it, or are we still asking whether this is going to become mainstream?
That's great. I would, Chris, why don't we, I think we're in violent agreement that we are in an inflection point, a tipping point, just like 2006 and the cloud. Maybe we start out with definition of what do we mean composability.
Please.
Chris, why don't you take?
Yeah, I'm actually I very much believe that in technology and the web you see gradual evolution constantly, and then you see these large shifts, and this is a large shift, right? And I think at the root of this is the movement of the large monolith, the big web servers that contain everything, right? So CMS is not just content management, it's template engines, build tools, dictating your server environment, programming language, everything else. And I think that movement is just ever accelerating right now. So when we talk about, there's a lot of terminologies here. There's headless and decoupled and Jamstack and Mark and composable and so on, right? And they each and everyone deals with this move off the monolith, but they each also means a little bit different, right? So when you talk about headless, it's traditionally you keep the monolith, but you separate out the front end and you run that headlessly. And then I think composable well, as a start as a Gartner term around DXPs is, I think it's more now sort of used of saying, well, it's when you don't have the monolith all together, right? Where you're sort of saying, well, that's not just the front end, but we're saying the different modules we're using are sliced out in their own APIs and used from there, right? Jamstack is very much focused on not so much how you define the different APIs, but how it's all tied together, right? So how do you create cohesive web experiences here, right? Because I think one of the most beautiful parts of, for example, going headless with your CMS or your commerce layer is that the fact that what it isn't, right, no longer dictates the web experience. How do you build these powerful web experiences where you use the best practices of creating really performance, scalable, and secure websites? And so that promise is what the Jamstack focuses on. And Mark is going in even more so than Composable and focusing on, well, if you're building this way, right, what should it be? It should be multi-tenant, it should be software as a service. That's much more sort of strict requirements for being sort of Mark certified. But again, I think at the end of the day, the big takeaway here is that we're talking of migration at large scale off the traditional monoliths to a place where you put together a solution with best-in-class services. And so I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about sort of why is that and how did that come to be?
Sounds good, but Eric, what do you want to add?
Sure, from an inflection point, and I know in the audience I see some, boardroom level, executive leadership team problem solvers. And what we know is that when we're tackling big problems in an organization, if we say, yeah, let's do a monolith, let's do big bang, let's take the most complex thing and do it all at once. Charles, what's the success rate of that?
0.
Exactly. So what we know is that when it comes to digital, big programs, the failure rate is enormously high. Some cite it as 85%. What the 15% that succeed is they take big problems, the monoliths, that are largely a lot of technology that's clustered together, and they break it into its parts. So one, we have that backdrop of organizations saying, I cannot tackle the big thing all at once and rely on big vendor or big systems integrator and have kind of the one or two throats to choke. I need to make this a more modular, more componentized way of going forward. So I think with that backdrop, the timing is right to say, those that are succeeding wildly by breaking apart and making the front end decoupled and separate from the back end, making different parts API based so you can stitch them together. And what's different this time, and certainly Chris, I know you've got a deep, both, and Nicole as well, a deep point of view on business people have more confidence that it doesn't require a PhD or a technical expert to take those modules and assemble them to solve business problems. So just like 2006, we're right in it.
So what I'm hearing is, from a technical standpoint, we've got a few key elements. APIs, this is cloud native. We're talking about the idea that this isn't a monolith, but these are some core components that are pieces that are readily integrated together that allow us to do a whole variety of things. Now, part of this, and you both touched on this, but I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about it, is about empowering teams to work independently, but in coordination. Chris, can you talk a little bit, especially about what you guys are doing at Netlify, that helps to empower the technical teams to do that? Because we often think in terms of, especially in my world around content, marketing teams that are dependent on development teams in order to make any content changes. But actually there's a whole lot of dependency that sits even within development and IT organizations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is there's a journey towards composable architecture, and I think it's also a story of empowerment of developers, right? Whereas before you had your developers in a marketing organization might do, essentially cutting out Photoshop files to HTML, right? And then you have these big operations and these big IT departments that actually have to sort of implement it, and you have a lot of operational overhead. And the journey now is much more around empowering these teams that are able to do so much more, right? Without, with serverless functions and edge functionality and new workflows and so on, it's a technical enabler, right? These developers teams are now able to do so much more than they were before. which is pretty fascinating. What it also means is that it's a new sort of workflow layer where the first journey to the cloud became sort of well, you have to go and you no longer have your own metal, so to speak, right? You're abstracting that away, but the workflows are yours. You have to go into, the Home Depot that is AWS and get your building blocks and build it out yourself. And that's now being abstracted away in these workflows. And that enables developers to do so much more, to do full-fledged, very powerful applications without having to lean on operations, right? It's not about being better at setting varnish caching, it's about never having to do it again. And so, like, it is this journey for the developer of absolute empowerment, and that also means that these teams, as you talked about, are able to do so much more. But another part of this is that because the different solutions dictated the entire stack before, architecturally speaking, they were also very siloed, right? So if you look at your .com with might have a big e-commerce connected to it, well, they're gonna have a ton of enterprise stakeholders, and it has to plug into Salesforce and HubSpot, and you have all these people. So of course you're gonna need super fine grained access control, and so in essence, the business need will dictate a very sophisticated large solution. Now, because that also dictates your web properties, if you're gonna have some landing pages over here, they're not gonna go on the same system, that wouldn't be very viable, right? But in this new world, that web experience layer is decoupled from what lies behind. So you're still gonna have a lot of stakeholders in your .com with a huge e-commerce, and that's fine. But the choice of that system doesn't dictate how you're building it out for anyone consuming it in the other end. And that means that these silos are being broken down, right? So if you go to, let's say one of our clients makes very popular fitness equipment, right? And they might have a screen where someone is telling you to do something faster, right? And you have to log in. And,
Does that exist?
and you have a history and so on, right? And that would obviously normally be completely decoupled from what you were doing for the web, right? Where you would, again, let's say they had a large e-commerce presence, right? And they have a big .com, and they would also have these developer documentation and marketing pages, right? But now they can have a web workflow that actually encompasses all of that, which is, brings untold efficiencies. So yes, we're talking about the technological change, but it actually is so far reaching into the organizations that we're talking about change management, right? We're talking about something that fundamentally changes how we're building digitally. And I think the reason why it's being propelled so much is because at the same time we've evolved, and I know I'm going a little further here, but at the same time we've evolved to a place where most business problems have digital solutions, right? And so that carries sort of a new need. If you go back 7 years ago when we started Netlify, we couldn't sell developer productivity because no one would be investing in that. Mm-hmm. And now it's becoming recognized as one of the primary ways of addressing one of your primary concerns, which is we need to decrease our time to market.
Well, let me pick up on that with you, Eric, because there are a few points there that were really important ones that you touched on, Chris. One is the time to market. One is the autonomy of teams. And the other is the fact that this is ultimately a change program. This isn't just about implementing some new tool or new piece of technology, or even several pieces of technology that you implement together. Eric, talk to us a little bit about what kinds of transitions you see companies going through, and what typifies the organizations that are really making the most of this change.
Absolutely. So two things, and at V-Ship with our clients, with active clients right now, we're doing a lot of work on governance, right? So part of this is the acknowledgement that this is a team sport, and the cross-functional coordination, just like you said, it's more modular, so that different parts of the organization, I'll just name them, marketing, sales, product services, support, legal, risk, compliance, content, which is kind of a common thread in different organizations often, obviously IT, security, all need to come together. It's a team sport. I'll throw a little bit of a dart at Gartner because, Suze, we have read a lot of reports recently of the IT and marketing collaboration, the partnership between the CIO and the CMO, which is yesterday's news. I mean, that goes back to 2006 because it's more of a partnership of all those groups that need to come together, because this is a containerization of different modules that have their own security. They've got authentication rules. They've got a lot of intelligence that make them come together. So one, it's rethinking of governance in a new way that, to Gartner's credit, when they describe what's called a composable business or the composable enterprise, say that there's a business architecture that needs to come together. And it's really the governance and how does IT, marketing, and other parts quickly make decisions to move forward. Now, Chris, we've talked about this for both Contentful and Netlify. The 15% of the marketplace that is really winning tend to be digital native-born digital companies. Generally VC-backed, they're unicorn valuations, they're the disruptors in industry. And that governance and that set of processes is already baked in to their talent, their hiring, and so forth. So there's a business architecture level that starts with governance. The other thing I'll admit, I'm excited about the World Cup. The US had a qualifier. I'm super disappointed for another day. I won't belabor the point on soccer, but we were talking, Danish team looks great this year. As a team sport, when we look at those different parts that come together, often an organization will say, well, marketing, you take offense. You do the brand, you do the campaigns, top line growth, you do the experience. IT, we're gonna play defense. But you know what? We really don't like each other. We don't wanna work together, but we're gonna be on the same field and coexist. So to the point of the processes, the governance, the new way of defining your roles and coordination are really that everyone has a part in the field, and it's not just offense and defense, but it's a whole part that comes together, and it's a new way of operating your business. Everyone has a part, including compliance, risk, other members of the team, that it's part of a new job, is to understand what are those parts that come together.
Yeah, it's interesting because what is not implicit in the idea of composable is that of decoupling. You talked about it, Chris, that we're talking about decoupling content from where it gets displayed. We're talking about decoupling various aspects of development operations. We're talking about separating some of these things in ways that make it very easy for teams to work really autonomously. But the flip side of the coin is if we aren't also making it easy to ensure that there's a high degree of coordination between those things, we risk running in opposite directions and not actually hitting the mutual objective. What strikes me is that you're talking, Eric, about digital natives that are the most obvious examples of the winners here. But we're in an environment where, Burger King might sell hamburgers, but it's investing in its digital products the same way it's investing in whatever menu innovations it has, because they know that in order to sell hamburgers, they also have to have digital products, mobile apps, other ways of engaging with their customers that are ultimately the way that they sell those hamburgers. Talk a little bit about what that change means and how we get to that in a reasonable way. So we talked about Big Bang isn't gonna win. What about this 1-year plan and 5-year vision kind of idea?
Great, and that's a good plug. In our gift bags, you'll see a hat for Decoupled, which is an offering that we have that is around getting started and helping organizations navigate. And part of this is, we like calling it jumpstarting or having a beacon project. Chris, I think you had mentioned, part of the beauty of this modularity and this composability is that you can take part of a complex experience and you can say, you know what, the checkout cart, I think the example you gave is, takes 45 seconds to load. And you can take that module and you can take an experience that's focused on a certain conversion without disrupting the rest of the monolithic landscape and tackle something. So we see that as a good beacon or a good way of jumpstarting into getting the organization to get all those players together. So it's not a heavy lift, but it's something meaningful that's gonna deliver business results and outcomes that will pave a way forward for the rest of the organization to say, well, you know what, we should do the menu site beyond the checkout. So the modularity, the composability can really be specific and high value, or it could be broader, or it could be a whole public website tied into a digital product, or increasingly what we're seeing now with where we are from talent and retention, a real focus internally on attracting but really engaging, revitalizing your workforce. I'm not sure if that, if I got off track with the plug on our decoupled offering, but it is to help organizations get into the arena and learn by doing.
And I think another point that you touched on there is the idea that you can start small and iterate and expand from there, which I think is something we all are pretty violently in agreement. That's a theme here among the three of us. Chris, though, part of this is the idea of ecosystem, and composability is both a question of complementary architectures, but also this idea that you're not just creating the tools to present digital experiences to customers. You're actually literally building the tool set that your teams need, and a whole variety of different teams, in order to do the work of creating those experiences and building and using the content that goes into them effectively. So talk a bit about the maturity of the ecosystem and how that's impacting what's possible now. And I know this is something that is near and dear to your heart because you guys have actually invested in the Jamstack Innovation Fund to try to help seed and grow more of those companies in the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to comment here, I think the most beautiful part of composable architecture is the gradual migration, right? It is when you traditionally move from one system to another, you can get a lot of pushback because people are used to saying, well, I have this thing, it's gonna take me years to build out this other thing, then I port all the content, I flip the switch. And now I'm on dated technology, because even when it first goes live and 40% of my budget is tied up and renewal, something I get nothing in return for every year, right? And I think the idea of composable is that it's so much easier. You get started in weeks instead of months and years, and you can slice out these corners. But what can you do with composable architecture? That and the Jamstack, that is being pushed constantly, right? So when we started out with Netlify and coined the terminology around Jamstack, I would say, and we sort of defined what does the space look like. There were a handful of companies there. It was a market trend that didn't exist. So Contentful was one of them. We were there, and there was 2 or 3 others. And today it's maybe 2,500 companies, right? And not only that, but you also have a lot of the traditional large legacy players now saying, well, we're all about being an API, we're all about composable, we'll do everything we can to ride that wave as well, right? Because they see it coming. Of course, you can argue that they're not natively so, and so, as someone investing in that workflow, you might want to consider that. But yes, when it comes to that ecosystem, part of this, and this going back to this empowerment of the web developer, right, of being able to do so much more, right? And so since we started, serverless came out, now we have advanced edge functionality, right? So essentially, instead of having a website that has an origin and then you're caching something a little bit all over, your website now, or your web property, or your web application now just has multiple points of origin. Not only that, but you can also do distributed compute on all those edge nodes, and that gives you tremendous power, right? And there's constantly these companies pushing that forward, right? And so with the Jamstack Innovation Fund is both us investing and us attaching an accelerator to that, where there's a big focus area on how do we really work together? What's the interoperability standard? How do we communicate these services in between? Because I think at large companies at scale, what we all do is provide part of a solution, and what they all buy are whole solutions, right? And so how do you circumnavigate that? How do you come across the one throat to choke? And I think you do that by creating something where it really is a holistic way of plugging in whatever your needs. That's why we built Netlify. That's an orchestration platform that allows developers in an easy way to use this content system and this commerce and so on, and they have these set built and distribution processes for it. And I think as an ecosystem, it's very important that we don't build off in 100 different directions, because that doesn't help anyone, right? And I think there is this collaborative spirit that I'm really enjoying between a lot of the successful companies of realizing that, hey, this has to work together, right? This is a journey that only completes if we have a strong industry focus on interoperability, and so that's what we're pushing forward with the fund as well.
Good. Well, I can say we are all beneficiaries of that, so thank you. You talked about the richness of the ecosystem and interoperability. This is an essential part of making composability work, but it presents some other challenges. And you also mentioned the one throat to choke. I mean, anybody who's ever dealt with a large technology vendor of any description knows that leverage over your technology provider is sometimes very useful. We don't necessarily have that when we start talking about composability. but we also have a greater degree of flexibility. What are some of the challenges that come, and Eric, I'm gonna throw this one over to you, in terms of how we actually make the transition? How do we get to adoption? Because a lot of large organizations are not really well set up
Sorry about that.
to buy these composable technologies. I mean, what we've all bought as large businesses for a long time is big business applications. So how do we start making that transition, and how do we balance the opportunity with an understanding that maybe the risks that we're used to are not the same? And so there's an inbuilt degree of risk mitigation because of the approach we can take with composable architecture that maybe presents some different challenges in how we procure it.
Absolutely, and so procurement, the CFO, vendor management, let's lump them in. They're one of those field players that needs to be a part of the solution. Often we find that they're a big blocker because the CFO sends a mandate to say, you know, our golden rule here is that fewer vendors equals less overhead and cost containment. In composability, it's completely the opposite. So I talked to a group of national advertisers just last week, and we said, well, you know, this is one of the keys to help unlock, because in addition to time to market, operational autonomy, the business flexibility, the cost savings are significant when you compare the expense of a big systems integrator, a big tech vendor that's wanting to maximize their solutions, because your respective solutions have a flexible pricing model based on utility, based on the problem that you're solving. It can scale up and scale down. Often when we're looking, the cost for a group of what might be 6 different headless, serverless technologies can be 10, 15, 20% the cost of big tech vendor, right? You're solving a big problem, you're doing it faster, you're doing it with more autonomy, and it's far, far cheaper. But if the CFO says, well, you know what, these headless and serverless solutions are not, they are designed for credit card swipe, for easy procurement to be turned around quickly, but we don't subscribe to that. We want to do big MSAs to get started. Boy, that's part of the organizational constraint, that you're going to have to turn that corner with the CFO and vendor management and procurement, because there are more relationships to manage. Candidly, they're pretty simple. And I'll just ask Dan on the Netlify side, as a partner, often we will help stand up, but the transfer to the client is less than a day, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's push button basically, so. Yeah,
So
the transfer is easy, but like you said, getting the blocking, tackling of getting accounts set up is often the biggest hurdle.
Right, so some cases, 90 days to go through a procurement cycle, 1 day to get it running to solve your business problem.
Less than it.
And 90 days is being generous, right?
It's a very different implementation equation though, for anybody who goes back to the bad old days of ERP, like I do.
What I will say, and I know Brian and others on your team have kind of dealt with this, there's a lot of ROI modeling that is, you know, some of it quite elegant, you know, very financial analyst oriented. You know, what we do often is, look, you need a headless search, you might need embedded personalization, you need the headless CMS, you need the edge computing and serverless functions, and basically your infrastructure. These are all different procurements. Let's look, it's all published pricing. This is what you're all in for in month 1. And quarter to quarter, this is gonna go up as we need to increase our SLA, as we need more advanced spaces. And they can clearly see, oh, though I'm working with 6 different account execs, I see the big picture here, I see the whole solution, and they can go work with the CFO to get approval for multiple card swipes, for multiple procurements.
Also, maybe just to supplement on that, right? Because I think the reasons for going composable in the first place has to do with performance, right? So at the end of the day, you enable yourself, if you follow best practices, to have sites and applications that load at a fraction of the time, right? Deloitte Digital was out publishing a huge report that says that in 100 milliseconds, you lose 8% of conversion. So just that faster time to load is actually incredibly important, right? You also have much faster time to market. Like, it's much easier to publish something very quickly. You have big benefits around security. 97% or something like that. I don't have the exact number, but of malware is targeting these large monolithic services because they have to build and be public and available at all times, right? So being able to separate that out is hugely beneficial for security. Of course, we talked a bit about the flexibility and the scalability as well here, right? I think there's a lot to say for even for employee retention. If you look at engineers, software engineers and developers, their work is their CV, right? It would be the same as if we went to a marketer and said, well, we're only gonna do these obscure legacy print ads for the yellow pages, right? They said, well, you know, building a career in that might not be great for me, right? So maybe I'll go somewhere else. And it's the same, right? I mean, I was just speaking to one of our larger clients that said they came in a legacy system and it was costing them one developer per week in churn that they were on such a legacy stack working on legacy programming languages. So there's, and that list goes on. So there's a lot of reasons for going composable. But I think why, in the cases it isn't happening, which what you were saying, like what are the challenges here, right? I think those has to do a lot with the one throat to choke, right? You can also say, well, do I have the educated workforce here, right? How do I go about it? And I think often, especially as you're not just doing it for one project, but as you start adopting it as a company in general, like how do we migrate, how we build, digitally speaking, to a more composable architecture, you very quickly run into building out your own monolith. Because where's the orchestration layer? How do you actually do it? And I think in that solution layer, is where you, for example, use an orchestration platform, right? Something that's built to cater this for viable workflows for developers. So you don't need to build out a big monolith. So you can still reap the advantages of not having these huge operations and that overhead, right? And I think, you know, making sure that you choose, I would at least suggest the native content management and commerce systems and so on that are out there that truly are built headless from the beginning. There's so much to benefit from that, right? And then I also think like using like agencies in the way you talk about where it's clearly defined, it's time boxed, and it's with certain budgets, it can be a great way of getting started. And then most importantly, going back to the one thing that you don't do everything at once. It's such a backbone thing for so many of us to think that, hey, I have one system, I'm using a new one, right? You don't have to. It's not even recommendable, right?
Yeah.
Take it a little slice at a time, right? Figure out what success looks like, how it actually interoperates with the rest of your team, of the organization, have those learnings, and then go from there. And it's such a powerful play you can make here, right? But as you were saying in our prep earlier here, that it is also important to remember that these are power tools. That if you use platforms like Netlify, Contentful, and so on, right, you can do a lot with them. But you also need some sort of organizational maturity there. That's also where I think that an agency can be incredibly helpful, right? But it's not, if you only have an IT org and they're not invested in this and saying, I'm just gonna go around them and go and buy these systems, that's gonna be hard. You're gonna need to have some internal stakeholders that can help carry this. But it's not an organization of 10 or 100 or 1,000. A few people can often be enough.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I'll just frame up our sort of closing comments here. Part of what is so important and valuable about composability is this idea of designing for reuse. Whether it's designing API-based microservices, thinking of the way you build and use content so that it's reusable across channels, not even just over the website, but across any kind of digital channel. It's about thinking very differently in terms of efficiency as well. So we talked about speed, not just page loading, but time to market. But it's also a question of how we free up the resources that we have in all of our teams so that we're not busy doing the rote stuff, we're not doing the mundane day-to-day work, we're actually freeing our teams to understand and identify the opportunities. And instead of thinking about how they're gonna be doing something and worrying whether they're able to execute, they're thinking about what they should be doing next, because they have the tool set that is gonna allow them to bring whatever vision they can think of to life, whether it's building digital products, engaging customers in new ways, thinking more creatively about how they leverage what they've already done to be more consistent and more impactful. This is the set of changes that we're ultimately talking about. So Eric, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I'll ask a few folks. I know, Roland, you're a CTO, you employ a lot of developers. Can you comment, how important is the choice of tools for retention and keeping dev and tech talent?
It's two-sided, right? So working in older technologies, and say .NET is older technology, then there's a little scare about what can I do now, and then productivity-wise, it's just it's a big relief going to the newer models where you don't need to install stuff on your local machine for days before you get something. You're basically up running in a few minutes. That's a big thing. So from a developer's perspective, there's a lot of happiness going that route because it goes so fast that you can feel productivity.
Right.
Where going back is like, push the button, drink a coffee, go back, oh, then you can see my page. And it's not even a joke, right?
Well, and looking at the non-technology group, speaking for employees of a head of digital or a chief marketing officer, I mean, the reality, and Nicole, I know you've written about this in your analyst career of, an accurate and truthful job description is 20% of your time will be non-value added activity, learning how to work with an antiquated software that IT won't get rid of. Another 20% of your time will be doing kind of a mundane work that otherwise could be automated by a script or a bot, right? So when we're talking about fulfillment in your job and your career, which is particularly important now more than ever, this has a really meaningful human capital implication, not only to technology employees, but to all facets of the business, where they're more focused on the intellectual property, writing the right message, engaging the right way. Roland, you were going to say something.
Just comment on something you mentioned before, like I feel from what a lot of our clients is bigger retailers. I mean, moving to composable is some way tough because it requires a lot of a move from leadership. I mean, because there's a lot of folks that have been working there forever. They know their technology. That's not going to move, and a lot of places they have so much internal power or small, sub thing that no, I'm doing my stuff here, but I'm doing this SQL batch job for the last 20 years. That's going to last for another 20 years, and that is the biggest challenge that I see. That it requires a very strong leadership, and a lot of places that is not happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the observations we made when we were chatting earlier is that this really isn't for everyone.
No.
And it may be at some point, but it's not yet.
For sure.
And yet the value and the power of going down this path is so tremendous that I think we're going to see a very big distinction start to emerge. And in fact, we sort of do already, to Eric's earlier comment, that the organizations that get this are going to operate so much more effectively than it's.
There's also the tools, like you're used to that model, you're used to that big system where you set everything up. Now I have to jump between. If you don't do something special, a dashboard, you have to jump between 5 different systems because now it's all composable.
You kind of think the last 2 years have taught us maybe we need to get used to changing pretty radically, and sometimes very quickly, and yet somehow that message hasn't quite landed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also what we see, right? There's a fear change, but there's also, I would say, in a lot of these big operational IT departments, there's this, well, I need to be able to control this, right? Because in the old world, you really did, right? You can't have a black box and cache and headers. You spend thousands of hours on optimizing for that. So the solution comes away and saying, well, that's actually just been abstracted away. By default of architecture, it's always as close to perfect as you get. Like, you don't need to optimize any of it. Then that automatically triggers, hey, no, we need to be able to come in here, right? And so I have tons of conversations with someone saying, well, I'm not sure how we're going to guard against SQL injections, and I have to remind them there is no SQL. There's nothing to guard against, right? But so like there's actually a lot of that education that comes in, right, where it's not just afraid of change. It's saying like those changes in a legacy architecture actually would be fairly detrimental, right? It would mean like you can't live up to what you're hired to do, which is control and oversight, right? And uptime, security, and I think like that's on us, all of us, the ambassadors out there, the brand ambassadors for the different companies, but also just the ambassadors for the technology that are driving this, and the vendors themselves to come out and really educate around like, hey, like the rules of the game and the narrative in total has also changed, right? And so how can we help push that message forward? Because it is true, like there's so many blockers in that. And then of course they're the ones that say, well, it worked yesterday, so let's sure it works.
Well, I'm going to close this out where I started, which is to say, it's a different level of industrialization that we're getting to. I mean, I could go and weave my own cloth if I want to, but if I got to wear something tomorrow, that's not the way I'm going to go. So I think we're headed for the next level of framework changes and mindset changes because the technology is already there. It's just now a question of how effectively we can use it.
That's terrific. Now, I love when a sequel joke lands. That, it killed. Which means we're in for a really great time. We're at the wrap-up part, right? I think we can take some questions now, or?
Yeah, or we can always take more over cocktails upstairs as well, it's as you wish.
Are there any burning questions before we go up to the 12th floor?
I got a quick one. You asked about a time horizon, but then we never really got back. Does the panel have any thoughts on time horizons? Where are we in this maturity cycle?
I'm gonna throw out mine while you're jumping the mic up there, Chris. I think we're at that point where we are crossing the chasm. I think we're at the early majority, there's already a raft of early adopters, and now the question is, how does this start to become mainstream?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, like you have the 12 to 75% of enterprises saying, hey, we need to go composable, and or we would if we started over without DXP. And Netlify, we started out a couple of people a while back, and now we have 3 million developers on the platform. We're adding another 100,000 developers and businesses every month, right? So just by our own numbers, we see a bunch of growth, right? And I think, like, again, the ecosystem has vastly matured. And if you look at the web, right, of course you start by, 0.1% of the web is a lot, right? But now I think it's very hard to measure, because anything that's built this way, often because it doesn't have to run on the fly on a traditional monolithic server, you don't actually see necessarily the right tax on it. But we are up in several percent now, right, of the web, and it's accelerating all the time. So I think when it comes to timing, we are past the point of no return. It's a super tanker. So you look at something like, the most popular CMS in the world, WordPress, right? They grew even when the technology they were using was sort of saying, well, there's gonna come an end to it, right? And in the last few years, it's tapered off, right? And so that the timing is now. We're seeing it. It is happening right now. And I think what we're starting to see is also that a lot of enterprises are realizing if we don't do it now, it's not a question of missing out on certain disadvantages. It means that we refrain from being competitive, and that hurts today, hurts even more and more.
I'll just add a comment that I think when we look back 2006, when you had made the comment, 2007 was a watershed year, and it was a confluence of not only cloud, but it was the mainstream adoption of social, but it was really smartphones and social leveraging the cloud and the infrastructure fabric. So a few different things all converging at the same time. The genie's out of the bottle, there's no return. But I think, Morgan, the question is, how fast and what are those other facets? What we talked about here is one of the facets, which is an organization's ability to change and overcome the inertia. We go through faster time to market, greater autonomy, greater flexibility, employee fulfillment. If Jim is still here, Jim Casey, I think we talked about this earlier, that makes total sense. But how quickly can I convince the rest of the players on the field to come with me and really pursue that? Once that's mastered, I think there's really going to be a hockey stick kind of adoption.
Yeah, just adding, like, if you look at the web, right, lamps that came out, dynamic sites, right, we stopped just, having hyperlinks, and everyone would say, well, I have a dynamic website, or I have a, Web 2.0 website, or whatever they call it, right? But within a few years, you just had a website, because everyone built this way, right? So I think that this nomenclature will outlive itself. And if you ask me for a timeline for that, I do think if we all gather here again in 5 years, it's just, that's how we built it.
Yeah.
So,
Remember
right?
when it was e-business? Now it's just business.
Now it's just business. Sorry, I keep shutting on it.
So Natalie, I'll take your cue.
I think we're ready.
Any other questions?
Yes, where's upstairs?
Justin?
If it is the case that this kind of architecture is not for every organization, at least right now, what are the externally observable characteristics of those corporations or organizations for which it does make sense?
I think the most basic is technical competence. There's got to be some bench strength of technical capability from a development perspective, but also I would call it technical astuteness on the part of management to understand that this is a critical area of investment for overall business strategy and not just something that's tied to the website or a mobile app. That's my take.
Absolutely, and I think like this journey, for example, to microservices API started a long time ago, right? And so if you look at companies where, for us, for example, like it doesn't make a lot of sense to engage with someone that's still sort of, no, we on-prem only, like we're only doing monolith, right? Everything is in, a legacy, proprietary language or whatever it might be, right? And because then you have to take them through a giant education, right? And that doesn't make a lot of sense to take on as a startup, right? Directly, you would do that through more broader education. So I think for us, we look at some of those markers, right? Of saying, well, have they embraced this idea of splitting out services elsewhere in the business, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos back in 2007, I think, wrote out to everyone, it wasn't just about IT architecture, but it was also about sort of just looking at their business practices in the same philosophy, right? Can we slice out these things and drive them as separate units, right? And I think there's a lot of trying to identify an organization. So external markets, for us at least, very often it has to do with looking at the existing tech stack. Has it been embraced elsewhere in the organization? And then, as you say, absolutely, like you need some technological leaders that want to go all in on this, right? To at least try it out. And yeah, otherwise it becomes hard. And then the last part is that I think, and we talked about this before, right? We passed the days of Oracle sort of, Oracle, if anyone's more right? This idea of top-down selling, right? Like today these solutions are always sold either through developers or with developers. I can't remember a sale where it was chosen by someone and then just handed off saying, here, this is what we're gonna work with, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be self-architected, thoroughly bottom-up. It can be a top-down motion, but the developer buy-in here is incredibly important. And I think that part of it is here to stay. That's never gonna go back, in my opinion.
Middle out, right?
Not top.
Sorry, it's the
Sorry, I
feedback.
guess we're trying to manage the feedback. So definitely not top down, middle out, enrollment and alignment from different groups. But in your domain, Justin, I think the leading indicator is the organizational agility. Does the organization think of themselves as a modular or a Lego block system? The leading indicator would be, are they highly acquisitive? Have they divested? Are they acquiring and integrating? Are they doing geographic expansion? Are they incubating new growth products and services? All that you can look at a complex organization and say, oh, that's in their DNA. They're thinking in a modular way within their business. Boy, this gives them the ammo to then really cook with gas.
That's a great answer.
And on that note,
Questions was, where's upstairs? So the roof deck, and we couldn't have had a better day for this. We've got lots of a wide variety of drinks and food and great conversation to continue. It's on the 12th floor. Matt Huntington, if you can raise your hand there. I think we have some of the V-Shift team that can guide you to the elevators.
he's our chief elevator officer.
I think most elevators go to 12, but now's a good time to break and continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you all.